Silverized Society.
Welcome to this unauthorized episode of the Silverized Society podcast, where my co-host, Salome Siboney, is out gallivanting across the capitals of Europe, recording podcasts and doing the work of the Silverized Society in the outside world. I sit here and labor. I labor for you, the audience of the Silverized Society. My particular labor this evening is the following. Months ago, I promised to do an essay on Mulholland Drive, and I have struggled with this. I have tried to record a solo podcast, a kind of YouTube video essay in the traditional way, and I have failed. I don't like it. I don't like not having the camera here, not feeling like I actually have people watching. I'm just kind of sitting here doing a solo narration thing. It feels weird. It feels weird to me. So even though I am doing a solo episode right now, somehow having you here visually, my audience of the Silverized Society, feels better. So we're going to do a little more laid back. I'm not going to try to make everything perfect. I'm going to more of a discussion. You may ask yourself, what discussion are you going to discuss? What are we discussing here? And I'm going to say the following. I'm going to say to you, dear audience, we're discussing Mulholland Drive as lesbian vampire movie, strangely correlated to 19th century novel Carmela by Sheridan Le Fanu, who was an Irishman. Don't know why he had the French name. But we're doing something special. It's a special unauthorized episode. No one knows what I'm doing besides myself. I'm going to go through and explain my theory, and then I'm going to try to edit in scenes from the film. I'm not exactly sure how YouTube reacts to that, because there may be copyright notices, whatnot. We don't know. Who knows? This may be taken down for disinformation, for lesbian vampire disinformation. But that's what we're going to try to do. So here we go. First off, what I should say is, if you've never seen Mulholland Drive, you don't need to watch this. There's no point. You can watch this if you've never read the 19th century novella Carmela by Sheridan Le Fanu. You don't have to read that. You can. It's free. You can go to Project Gutenberg, download it for free, read it on your phone, whatever, if you want. It's interesting enough. It's okay. I mean, it's a 19th century vampire novel. It's kind of important if you're into that, because it's one of the first. It's one of the first vampire novels out there in Western literature. But you don't have to have read it. I'm going to give you some quotations from the novel, and we're going to look at the film, and we're going to see how insane of a theory this is. Now, I came up with this idea because I had read Carmela several years before, and came up with this idea, but a couple of other people on the internet have noticed this as well, so I don't want to take sole credit for it. But as far as I know, it's a wacky idea, but I think I'm going to prove to you that there may be something to it. So let's start from the beginning. The beginning of the movie. Let's start actually instead by defining some names. Let's take the novella first. The novella is called Carmela. The bad vampire in it is named Carmela. Sometimes, though, she's sometimes named Mercala. And in the novella, the heroine, who is a kind of pure blonde victim of this vampire, her name in the book is Laura. Now, in Mulholland Drive, we have Camilla Rhodes / Rita. The first thing we want to look at, obviously, is that in Mulholland Drive, Camilla sounds very much like the novella Carmela, but the corresponding person in Mulholland Drive, the movie, is named either Betsy or it's later in the film, maybe she's Diana Selwyn. For this, we're just going to call her Betsy, and we're going to call her Carmela in the movie, and we're going to call her Laura, which is her name in the novella, and Carmela, the vampiress of the novel. Okay, so the novel starts out with a disastrous carriage ride. What essentially happens is Carmela the vampire is in this carriage with her mom, and they have a carriage accident. So, a quote. It seemed to be the traveling carriage of a person of rank, and we were all immediately absorbed in watching that very unusual spectacle. It became in a few moments greatly more interesting, for just as the carriage had passed the summit of the steep bridge, one of the leaders, taking fright, communicated his panic to the rest. And after a plunge or two, the whole team broke into a wild gallop together, and dashing between the horsemen who rode in front, came thundering along the road towards us with the speed of a hurricane. Let me translate that. They're in a carriage. The carriage starts going too fast. The carriage flips over. Carriage accident. What do we see in the movie? Well, what would be the modern correspondence to the carriage of a person of rank? One might say a limousine. And what do we see in Mulholland Drive? Carmela is in the back of a limousine, and there is an accident. And this is how the novella begins, and this is how the movie begins. So that's called the carriage connection. Now let's go and talk about what I call the sleeping during the day connection. That's not exactly a great name, but that's what I called it for my notes. Vampires love to sleep during the day. You know, they love it. Now, in vampire literature and lore, vampires don't have to necessarily be out of the daylight or sunlight, but they tend to be weaker during that time. Let's go to Mulholland Drive. See what happens there at the very beginning. Carmela in the film, if my theory is correct, is a vampire in a fairly weakened state at the beginning of the film. She then becomes stronger as she works her psychic vampiress lesbian magic upon the heroine of the film, which we're calling Betsy. So at the beginning of the movie, Betsy meets Carmela in the house, and Carmela says, I'm very tired. She also lies about her name, says she's Rita.
No, I need to sleep.
And this is something else that's also in the movie and in the novella. The names change all the time. So in the novella, Carmela, I may have said this already, calls herself Mercala sometimes to hide her identity. So identity, name changes, dreams, sleep, and a whole bunch of things going on here. But anyway, the point is that at her weakest at the beginning of the film, Carmela says she needs to fall asleep during the day. And she's asleep during the day. And later throughout the film, she'll be awake during the day, but there's quite a bit of the film is done during the night. Okay. Small connection, but an important one. And also in this scene, I guess I'll just throw in this small little thing. There's a note on the bed in Mulholland Drive, and it's addressed to Betsy. But if you look at the handwriting, I just thought this was strange. I can't write in cursive anymore. I learned as a child, I forgot it. I don't know what happened. I get some brain damage, something happened. I can't write in cursive anymore. But look, if you look at the word there, it looks like it says Bitsy instead of Betsy, as in Bitsy, a small bite of something. Am I stretching this too far? Are you with me still? Stay with me, because there's plenty more correspondences here. Okay, the Coco connection. Now, Coco in the film is not a huge character, but she is this motherly figure, maybe you could say, in the film who takes Betsy in. She runs the apartment. But later we find out she's actually going to become the mother-in-law of Carmela Rhodes because she marries the director. Now, a quote. She was what is called a fine-looking woman for her time of life. She's older and must have been handsome. She was tall but not thin and dressed in black velvet and looked rather pale, but with a proud and commanding countenance, though now agitated strangely. So, again, very pale, dressed in black, and more importantly, the quote I just gave you is a quote about the character, the mother of Carmela the vampire in the novella. Well, Coco in the movie becomes the mother of Carmela the vampire of the movie.
I don't believe you met my mother.
Then also another strange thing that happens, if I'm right about my theory, at the very end where Betsy ascends the hill up to the mansion, she's at one of her weakest points. Obviously not her completely weak. It's not good. Things are looking bad for Betsy at this part in the movie. There's a strange little interchange, and she says something like,
here she is.
I'm sorry I'm late for dinner.
Well, let's eat. I'm starving.
Well, again, if we assume that Carmela is the vampire and Coco is the mother figure of that vampire, also a vampire, which they were in the novel, Carmela, then Betsy is essentially apologizing for being late for being the victim of the vampire. Being late for dinner. She is the dinner. Okay. A quote. This is the Carmela beauty connection. Essentially, it's essentially simple. The quote is, she is absolutely beautiful, threw in Mademoiselle, who had peeped for a moment into the stranger's room. So this is the beginning of the novella. A maid or something walks in the room. Is like, oh, look at Carmela. She's really pretty. The same thing in the movie, right? I mean, obviously, Betsy is very attracted to Carmela, and Carmela becomes a movie star. So there's that other connection. I've mentioned already the identity and the name change connection, but the quotation from the book is, the name is Mercala. Well, I mean, Mercala is just an anagram of Carmela, and in the film and the books, there's this constant shift of identity and kind of mystery of who is who. So, like I said before, in the movie, Betty ends up as being called Diana Selwyn. We're not sure who she actually is. And Carmela Rhodes says she is Rita at some point. And then later, there's another Carmela Rhodes that is a different person altogether. So it's a little bit confusing, but that confusion is part of both the movie and the novella, which I see as very tied together here. So, the descent to the underworld. Now, this one I'm stretching a little bit. Here's a quotation. It was very near the turning point from which began the descent of Avernus. Avernus is this location in Italy that was thought to be a long time ago. It's a real place. It was thought to be a portal to the underworld. And so we may have mentioned this in our podcast about Mulholland Drive, which you can go back and watch if you like. But the movie starts with them in the Hollywood Hills up high, and then a descent into Avernus, which is Los Angeles proper. And then ultimately, Carmela, once she goes down and becomes a vampire and vampirizes Betsy, she goes back to her kind of hilltop mansion or whatever. And this is where there's a difference in the novella and the movie. In the novella, you have this character of the doctor, which is something you'll see in a lot of vampire fiction. There'll be a doctor that comes in. He's a doctor. He's crazy. But he's an occult doctor. He's got esoteric doctor knowledge, right? And he will usually come in and say, "Behold, look, there's a vampire. I know what vampires are. Here's what we got to do." That's in the novella. In the movie, that doesn't happen. In the movie, the difference between the movie and the novella is in the novella, Laura, the protagonist, is actually saved and the vampire is taken down. In the movie, the vampire wins. That's the difference. So let's see here. Another quote, and this is what I call it kind of the psychic vampire versus the physical vampire connection. I just wrote connection after every little point in my notes for some reason. I don't know why I did that. But it will, in these cases, husband and protract its murderous enjoyment with the refinement of an epicure, and heighten it by the gradual approaches of an artful courtship. In these cases, it seems to yearn for something like sympathy and consent. In ordinary ones, it goes direct to its object, overpowers with violence, and strangles and exhausts, often at a single feast. The point is, this is the doctor explaining to them, hey, there's a vampire in your mansion. he's explained there's different ways for vampires to get at their victims. And the first is the way we see in the film Mulholland Drive. In the film, there's no point where like Carmela grows fangs and wings and is a Batwoman vampire and just attacks the victim. That's not what happens. Instead,
it's more comfortable than the couch, isn't it?
she husbands and protracts and murders enjoyment with the refinement of an epicure and heighten it by the gradual approaches of an artful courtship. So this is a kind of psychic vampirism in the movie, as opposed to well, not really opposed to, because that's what kind of happens in the novella as well, though there is more of a just straight up I bite your neck type thing, a scene in the book. But because it was written in the 19th century, there was a couple things. First, they couldn't do hardcore vampire violence, and they also couldn't do hardcore lesbian vampire things.
Good night.
So, but if you read Carmela in their 19th century way, it's very clear that there is a undertone of lesbian vampire stuff, which you see in Mulholland Drive much more explicitly. Okay, so now here, I don't know why I wrote the victim vampire connection, but I did. So, quotation. A suicide under certain circumstances becomes a vampire. Okay. Controversial take here. In the film, what happens? Spoiler, Betsy commits suicide. Thus, the culmination of her status as a victim of the psychic vampirism from Carmela Rhodes. This isn't the podcast to get into a bunch of other lesbian vampire movies. It's a subgenre. But the folklore of the vampire in Eastern Europe, which I'm familiar with, does have this thing about one of the ways vampires come to existence is through a suicide. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that's the case. Obviously, because it's not in Christianity, it's no good, and those people would be buried outside of consecrated land, outside of the churchyard, all this kind of stuff. We don't need to get into that. But lesbian vampires, as all vampires, cannot... Okay, let me think of how to put this a different way. There is one similarity. How should I say this? Vampires create other vampires through doing vampire things. Lesbian vampires also do that. But there's an added psychological element to it, which is that the union of lesbians in the real world cannot generate another generation of human beings or vampire beings, right? So that's what I'm trying to get at here. So what the movie does, rather interestingly, is takes a lesbian relationship in the guise of a vampiric relationship, and then calls back to this folkloric element of the vampire, which is you can create another vampire through suicide. Just let you work out all the connections yourselves. So this is a broader idea I had called the drained connection. And again, forgive the little headlines. I shouldn't even read them to you. But the beginning of the movie in Mulholland Drive, you see Betsy is vital. She is happy. She's optimistic. She's in the sunlight. She's rocking out to her dreams from her small town in the big city. As the film progresses, you see she loses that vitality. She, at the end of it, literally, she looks like she's been drained by a vampire. And the reason I think that is because it's low-key a vampire movie. So Carmela has been basically draining her of life throughout the film. And I'll throw in some scenes to back that up. I just have something called the lesbian connection written here, but I think we've covered that well enough. That's all I'm gonna put forward. And this may seem like a theory that doesn't make any sense, but I think if you go back and you watch the film, you're going to see this. So you're going to see that an explanation for this film isn't just that it's a lesbian vampire movie, but without explicitly being so. Because I think there's different interpretations you can make in the movie. And what I would say, we said this in our podcast also, is that the way this movie was made is weird because it was going to be shot as a television show at first, and then that was put aside, and then they went back and recorded, I believe, to make it into a film. That's why I don't think there's not just one way of looking at this movie. There's not just one explanation for it. But I do think this is, if you watch the movie and you think of it as a vampire movie, you're going to see that after you watch it that way. And if you go back and read Carmela, then you will also see how strangely it seems to correspond to that work. That's it. It's my solo, unauthorized Mulholland Drive episode. I said I would do it. It's towards the end of the year, so I wanted to actually record it. It's on my list of things to do. And you, Silver Eye Society members, I don't like to make promises to and then not live up to them. So that's what I have to say here. Normally, I don't do the outros. I leave that to my co-host. But since I'm here by myself, I'll simply do the outro and say, hey,
I want to thank you for coming all the way up here to see me.
you can go to Patreon, sign up, give us some money if you want. Don't if you don't want to. It's okay.
Man's attitude goes some ways, the way his life will be.
You can find us on the usual social media outlets. And at Salome Siboney and at Justin A.W. Blair. And let me know if you want to hear some more strange movie essay ideas, some unauthorized episodes.
Is that something you might agree with?
Recorded at 4 a.m. And if you would like that, then I would be happy to try to do some more. All right. Thank you. Thank you. That's a very weirdly proper way to end an episode. Goodbye.